Hello everyone, in today's video I'm going to be going over the moral argument in the same book. This would be the last of these video series and I will probably move on to something else. But let us begin. Moral argument. What is right and wrong? We humans have been asking that question since the earliest days and we've seen all sorts of answers. People have many different views about how to be a good person. However, for the sake of this argument, we are interested not so much in which moral framework is correct, but in the simple fact that almost all people agree there exists some moral standard that each of us is obliged to follow. Moral values and duties. Few people say it doesn't matter whether you're good or bad or whether you follow your conscience. Even the most hardened skeptic who thinks morality is just an illusion will get mad if you punch him in the nose and steal his wallet. He'll still say, "Hey, that's wrong. Why'd you do that?" For more proof of this, just like young children, even toddlers understanding the ideas of rights, they shout, "Mine, mine, mine," and they get upset when another child takes their toys. There's a basic moral sense that seems innate within us humans. I live in Orlando, near Disney World, so I often see another example. Go to Disney, to any of the hour-long lines sneaking around the attractions, and skip ahead in line and see how many people react. Even when someone skips accidentally, the moral policing is sharp and quick. "Hey, what are you doing? You can't do that. We've been waiting here for hours. Get to the back of the line." We all experience an inborn sense that some acts are just right and some acts are just wrong. We all know there's such a thing as right and wrong, what we might call moral values. In addition to moral values, we also experience moral duties. It's not just what we see certain actions as right or wrong, but we feel compelled to do the right actions and avoid the wrong ones. An invisible law seems to guide our behavior. Something inside us, around us, or beyond us serves as a moral authority, constantly reminding us of the way we ought to live. Those thoughts, you ought to do this, or you ought not to do that, are what we call moral duties. Objective morality. So we have moral values and moral duties. The moral values tell us what is right and wrong. The moral duties tell us we ought to do the right thing. Those are the first two steps of the moral argument. The third step is to realize that at least some of these values and duties are objective. That is, they don't depend on personal feelings, preference, or opinion. For example, all sane people agree that it is morally wrong to torture young children for fun. We can all agree that we ought not to do this under any circumstance. There is nothing that could ever justify it. This is an objective fact. It's not one person's opinion that torturing children is wrong, or a moral fashion that may change over time. It's true at all times for all people, yesterday, today, and forever. If we were to meet someone who thinks torturing children is fun, we wouldn't say, "That's okay. He has his moral opinions, and we have ours." No, we would say to that person, we would say that person is empathetically wrong, and he is deeply misguided, probably psychologically disturbed. It's true that some people throughout history have been mistaken about objective moral facts, such as wrongness of slavery or torture, but it's only because these things are objectively wrong that we've been able to look back and acknowledge that these people were mistaken. If moral values and duties were just subjective, independent on personal beliefs or on the feelings of the majority of people, then we would have no ground on which to criticize past moral mistakes. But we do, and we're able to say, even though those people thought slavery was fine, they were wrong. Slavery was objectively wrong 2,000 years ago, 200 years ago, and is still wrong today, even if some people were confused about that throughout time. With all that in mind, we've now confirmed three things. First, we all have moral values, We all believe that some things are good and other things are bad. Second, we all experience moral duties. We all know that we should do good things and avoid the bad ones, even if we sometimes fall short of that goal. And third, at least some of these moral values and duties are objective. In other words, they aren't just personal preferences, such as our favorite type of music or ice cream, but are real objective features of reality. The moral lawgiver. If all of that is true, and almost all people believe it is, then we must ask ourselves, where do these objective moral values and duties come from? If there is a moral duty that seems to bind all of humanity, what or who gives it that authority? Or to put it more simply, if we have a moral law, where is the moral lawgiver? Now, there are logically only three possibilities. These moral values and duties come from within us humans, they come from nature around us, or they come from something beyond nature from a transcendent source. Let's look at each option. From humans. Can these objective moral values come from us humans? The answer is no, because people are ultimately subjective. People's opinions change and the moral mood shift. It's therefore impossible for individuals or groups to offer an unchanging standard by which to measure our moral performance. We can see this, for example, with Nazi Germany. And moral values and duties simply stem from society and human opinion, then we would have no biases to condemn the horrible Nazi, other than saying, I personally didn't like them. Or to use another example, even if the large majority of people believe slavery was acceptable, it's still wrong. Therefore, objective morality can't derive from us humans, from nature. Couldn't nature tell us how to behave? The answer is no again. Since, as the famous atheist David Hume noted, nature only shows us what is. It doesn't tell us how something ought to be. This is the famous is-ought problem in philosophy. For instance, nature can confirm that whenever we punch someone in the nose, it will cause them pain. That's the is. When you do this, that happens. However, nature cannot tell us that we ought not to cause others pain. That's a moral fact that we must get from somewhere else. Some atheists suggest that morality may be derived from evolution, but evolution suffers from the same problem. It may show which moral behaviors lead to survival. For example, making friends is more conducive to survival than making enemies, but it doesn't bind us to act in a certain way. Evolution doesn't require that we ought to make friends and avoid enemies, or even we ought to pursue survival above all else. These are moral assumptions that we get from somewhere else, from a transcendent source. So where do we get morality? In the end, we are left with only one plausible explanation. Morality must come from something beyond humans and beyond nature. It must come from a transcendent source of goodness. That is what we call God. Even atheists admit this implicitly. Richard Dawkins, perhaps the world's most famous atheist, has written that if atheism were true, there would be no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. In other words, without God, there would be no objective morality. But we do have an objective moral values and duties. Therefore, God must exist. This explanation makes sense of all the evidence. Why do we experience innate moral values, even as toddlers? Because we were created by God, the all-perfect source of goodness, who gave us an infinite knowledge of right and wrong. To use biblical language, God's moral law was written on our hearts. This explains why even people who don't believe in God feel obligated to follow moral rules and can still lead impressive moral lives. Why do we face moral duties? Because God has created us with a specific plan about how we ought to behave in order to live a good life that produces happiness. Why are these values and duties objective? Because they're grounded in God, who is an unchanging source. God doesn't bend and fluctuate like nature, society, or personal opinion. He is an objective standard. If you want to put the moral argument in a way that's easy to memorize, we want to sum it up like this. Premise 1. If God does not exist, objective morality does not exist. Premise 2. Objective morality does exist. Conclusion. Therefore, God exists. The conclusion logically follows if both premises are true, so you want to focus on those two premises. There are two good reasons to believe premise 1. First, almost all atheists admit this is true, including Richard Dawkins. And the quote we shared earlier, other leading atheists such as Michael Roos and the late J.L. Mackay affirm this too. Also, all the natural alternatives on which to ground objective morality, such as human society or nature, won't work because they are all subjective. They change and fluctuate, so they cannot be objective. There is atheistic ground for objective morality. We know that the second premise is true too, that objective morality does exist. Through our own experience and moral intuition, most sane people believe in objective morality. There are admittedly some who say they don't believe in it, but even they will get angry if you do something immoral to them, betraying their belief that morality is just a matter of personal sentiment. At their core, they really believe at least some moral values and duties are objective. So that's the short form of the moral argument. It's a good argument for God, and it shows how our sense of right and wrong ultimately point to a transcendent source of morality that we call God. Also, it doesn't just tell us that God exists, it tells us something about him and what he's like. God must be the embodiment of source of moral goodness, which is why theists consider God to be all good or perfect.